What is up, my Lorcana Goons? And welcome back to the Lorcana Goons channel. My name is Kevin, and we're going to go over some possible decks that you're going to see at your set championships or the Lorcana Championship qualifiers, or even the North American Continentals if you're competing. If you like this content, be sure to smash that like button, comment, and subscribe if you're a Lorcana Goon, because it does support the channel. My Lorcana Goons, we are in January. We are well deep within this Azurite Sea format, and there's a lot of decks that we can go over to talk about what's the best deck, what's a meta, how do we justify these tiers, etc. If you've been noticing a lack of content from us, it's because I am really preparing. I'm testing a lot for the North American Continental Championship, which I get to compete in on Saturday. So today is Thursday, and I've been really practicing a bunch of different decks, trying to decide what is the best deck to use for a 2-game format, for a best of 3 and top cut, or even if you're playing the LCQ or A set championships, what decks are you going to expect when going into these tournaments, or what decks do you want to try when playing these tournaments? So we have our tier list here. Huge shout out to Speci, by the way, for making a tier list already, and I added to it because there's some decks I feel like weren't here that I wanted to talk about. But we have our sections here. We have best decks, or decks, this is the tier 0 in my opinion, or even tier 0.5, and then we have better than good. This is a tier 1 section in my opinion. We have good, tier 1.5. Look at this as a tier 1.5 section. The good section is for decks that are definitely not better than good, but they're solid decks, right? Then we have mids. I would consider mids a tier 2 section, and then buns, which translates to absolutely unplayable. So those are our tier sections. Let's get on into this. First up, we have the Amber Sapphire Aggro deck. Now, this is an aggro deck that plays a lot of heroes. You're going to see the yellow and blue color combination come into play using the hero archetype with Ana braving the storm, which is going to be able to quest for 2 instead of 1 as a 2-cost character that has 4 willpower. That's pretty hefty, right? This deck also lets you play the new Alice Savvy Sailor, which is also a hero. This Alice is going to quest for 2. She has Ward, also a 1/4 stat line, but when this Alice quests, she has an extra ability to give another character +1 lore that turn and Ward until the start of your next turn. So because this is an aggressive deck, you're not playing many high-cost characters. The highest cost characters you have in here are going to be the Kita Protector of Atlantis, which you can shift onto your Kita Goons, or the 2 copies of Baymax, which will also let you gain 2 lore potentially if you're healing 2 damage on a character. That effect goes off when you play this character and when you quest with that character. So it's a pretty cool way to gain extra lore in an already aggressive deck if you're playing a Sapphire strategy. You also get to play the McDuck Manor in this list alongside 4 copies of Scrooge McDuck. Baloo and Donald, they're going to let you burst extra lore that your opponent might not see coming. And in the early game, you're playing 4 copies of Daisy, Nala to make sure you have those heavy willpower characters, because in the later game, oftentimes in this meta, people will not play around Rapunzel. So having 4 willpower characters like that truly pays off in my opinion. I really like the blue-yellow deck personally. I would like to see maybe Mufasa added to that list that we just saw, but in general, I think the blue-yellow aggro hero deck does have a place in today's meta. You're playing a lot of characters your opponent might not see coming. It is a good deck, however, I don't know how good it is when going on the draw versus on the play. I think if you're going first, the deck has a clear line to get to 20 very quickly, but if you're going second in that game, it might be a little bit more difficult to get there. I want to put it in the good section, which is, kind of a 1.5 tier, but I don't want to give it that much credit simply based off of the results that we've seen in this meta, and also based off of the amount of times you might see this in a tournament. I don't expect you'll see a blue-yellow aggro deck in most of these tournaments, so because of that, I will put it in the mids section. This is a tier 2 section though. Remember that, guys. This best decks is a tier 0 section, so that's for the best deck if there's even more than the best deck, right? So we will get into that conversation. I do like this deck though, don't get me wrong. I feel like you could still win a set championships with this deck. If I were to play a set championships with a color combination of blue-yellow, this is how I would play it. Maybe add some Mufasas in there, and I feel confident enough to win. Next up, we're going to go over Jafar decks, which are mostly purple steel Jafar decks. That's what we've been seeing in this meta since the beginning of the Azurite Sea launch up until even a week ago. We saw people using Jafar Striking Illusionist in their Amethyst Steel decks. There's also some Emerald Amethyst decks that play this Jafar as well, but I don't think that's too popular. Purple Steel Jafar is a mid-range control style deck that basically lets you burst the lore out of nowhere, because if you have Jafar Striking Illusionist exerted, you can gain a lore every time you draw a card. So the most disrespectful play you can do in this deck is turn 4 Jafar Dreadnought. Turn 5, you shift Jafar Striking Illusionist. Then you can sing Whole New World with this Jafar. He is then exerted. You draw 7 cards and you gain 7 lore. And after you have this Jafar on the board, you can play Friends on the other side, let the storm rage on. on, trigger your libraries, your blue fairies, etc. to keep drawing cards and gaining lore at the same time. Very strong card to add to your Amethyst Steel decks if you want to try it. I've been seeing people just play 4 of these in Amethyst Steel mid-range decks, but for sure the Jafar style deck is a mid-range deck. You get to play early game cards like a Robin Hood and a blue fairy, so you can shift and take advantage of that draw ability. But most of the Amethyst Steel decks are going to be using that idea of like being able to control the early game with either shift character, Storm Rage on. Being able to play peak game Jafar is also very good in Amethyst Steel because you're going to stop the opponent from using cards like Pirate's Life, Be Prepared, and even in the Steel Mirror matches, you stop those Amber Steel decks, those Green Steel decks from using their Storm Rage ons, their Zeuses, and their Strength of Raging Fires. All right, now the question is, how good is Jafar as an engine? How good is a Jafar deck? Now, I think it's better than Tier 2. The Amethyst Steel engine, I think, has gotten a lot more consistent in the Azurite C set, so I'll put it in the good section of 1.5, right in the middle, right there. I don't know if it can win a tournament right now. I'd like to think it could. I mean, by tournament, I mean like a continental tournament. Definitely could win a set championship tournament, I think. I would not be hesitant to take a Jafar strategy to a big tournament. I think if that's something you want to do, if something you've been practicing, because I know some people are definitely into the Jafar strategy, try it out your set championships for sure. I definitely think it's a good deck. And since we're on Amethyst Steel, let's talk about Amethyst Steel mid-range. The Amethyst Steel mid-range deck is a little bit different. I feel like this deck is a lot more well-known. You'll probably see this deck if you're playing at your LCQs. I imagine I'm going to play at least against one opponent who's playing an Amethyst Steel mid-range deck at the North American Championships. So this is an Amethyst Steel mid-range list by Earlmeister. It has a lot of different 2-ofs and 1-ofs, but a lot of the Amethyst Steel mid-range decks kind of play like this. You'll see copies of the Tinkerbell Giant Fairy. Some people even playing the 3-drop Tinkerbell as well in this deck. That's the Amethyst Tinkerbell that has evasive, that'll quest for 2. So you have a good Tinkerbell shift package. Really what I think this deck is also trying to do though is play a lot of 1-drops. As you can see, most of the Amethyst Steel decks are going to play around 12 1-drops. So you can start off on a good curve and then maybe play Calhouns or Smees, followed by Lawrence or Pete's. 4, you have your draw power of Genie Rabbits, and then you have Elsa's and Belle to control the board with Strength and Zeus as well. I like this version of the deck a lot. I think it does have a little bit of a tougher time against maybe Red-Blue, against Ruby Sapphire. The ability to have a lot of draw cards in this deck, like Dock as well as a backup engine, or maybe even some extra stuff like Friends on the other side, Libraries is really good. I do think that this deck is a little bit more consistent than some of the other decks in the format, which is what I really like about it. You're playing Chernabogs, Brooms, Diablos, and even Docks alongside like Friends. Depending on how you're building the deck, Earlmeister had his list. I'm sure a lot of people have their version of the deck, but in general, this deck has a lot of good consistency is what it feels like. So because of that, because of the ability to consistently play cards like Genie, Rabbit, and then seeing Zeus, Strength, or Smash, however you're playing the deck, right? I think you'll be able to consistently win a lot of games. Even in a 2-game format, this is a deck that I feel very confident in. I feel like you can 2-0 a lot of people with this deck if you're playing in the Continentals. I was heavily considering Amethyst Steel. I'm still heavily considering Amethyst Steel mid-range. Personally, I'm more of a little, I think I like the aggro version more. I think it's just as good. But the Amethyst Steel mid-range deck is very powerful. So I'm going to put it in better than good. It's going to go in the tier 1 section. So, and I don't know if it's the best deck, personally. I think it does have its flaws. You are a steel deck at the end of the day, so you are going to lose out to heavy control, like Ruby cards, like Be Prepared. They do hit you kind of hard. But what's really good about this deck is if you're playing Rabbits, Diablos, and stuff like that, or the Libraries, you don't really care about Be Prepared. Some people would argue this is the best deck. Personally, I think it's better than good, though. So if you are playing it, don't feel too worried. I want to go over the Purple Steel Aggro deck as well, because this deck is a little bit different. This deck plays Maleficence. This deck plays Befuddles. In my opinion, from the list that I've seen, most of them don't play too many high-cost characters. I don't really see many of them playing the Giant Tinkerbells. You don't really see them playing the 5-cost Bells. Some still play Elsas, some don't. Personally, I actually used this deck, or I used a list like this. That was Purple Steel Aggro for a 90-plus player tournament last week, and I did really well. I finished in top 4. I had a 6-0 record in a best-of-3 format with Purple Steel Aggro, and I think the deck is very good. I do have to give some credit to maybe my dice roll. I feel like the blue-red matchups that I had and I won, those dice rolls were very helpful for me. But I think it is a very good deck for your Lorcana set championships. A lot of people can't really play around this deck sometimes. You can quest really early with your Maleficence. You can play Smee, who quests for 2. You can play Calhoun. I think one of my favorite parts about this deck is Fire the Cannons, because you can protect your Maleficence and your Diablos and stuff with Fire the Cannons, so they constantly keep questing for 2. You also get to play White Rose and Go. A lot of times with the Purple Steel aggro deck, what ends up happening is you get to like 10, 12, 13 lore, and then you start top decking cards like Doc. Doc will get you a Goat and a White Flower. Suddenly you're at 15 lore, then you draw another Doc or a Friends on the other side if you're playing that, and you just draw your White Roses and your Goats to get you to 20 faster than the opponent. So yeah, so because I have like personal first-hand experience of doing really well with this deck, I think I'm going to have to put it in the better than good section as well. Tier 1.5 up there with the mid-range Amethyst Steel deck. Next up, we're going over the Burn deck. This is the Ruby Amethyst Burn deck. Red, purple, burn. Basically, what you're trying to do with this deck is constantly have characters on the board, play the locations, pre-prepare their board, and then keep generating lore with locations and some other cool cards. This is going to let you play cards like Maui Shark in a red-purple deck, which you don't normally see in Ruby Amethyst, right? Amethyst Chromacon, Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, which lets you just burst lore. Super Goof, White Roses, Merlin Goats, everything you can think of that'll like burst you lore you want to play in the Ruby Amethyst Burn deck. And we've seen this deck do pretty well at DLCs in the past. Not sure how well it did in the European Continentals, but I do see people playing this style of deck in my local scene. And because I see it locally, I can't put it in the buns or the mid section. I think it's a little bit better than that. I would put it in the good. I think it's pretty good. In fact, if I play in against this deck at any tournament, I definitely am afraid. I think it's a very good deck. I'm afraid to get 2-0'd by this deck because sometimes they can just play Maui Half Shark and just gain a bunch of lore if they're playing Gathering Knowledge, Pirate's Life, White Roses. Any action they play just becomes suddenly more lore for a deck that already doesn't care what you're doing. They just want to gain as much lore as possible using actions. And since we're talking about Rubiam, we got to talk about classic Rubiam. We all know what this deck does. Turn 1, Chernobog. Turn 2, Flynn. Turn 3, Sisu. Gain 3 lore. But what happens when you're going second? It is a little bit harder to win going second if you're not doing that line. So we have been seeing a lot of people play different variants of Ruby Amethyst. For the most part, we're seeing people change the ratios of rabbits and genies. Some people playing Shift, Sisu. Dragonfire is being seen in the meta as well because you need outs to Maui Shark. But this is a classic Ruby Am list, and personally, I am a Ruby Amethyst enjoyer. I really like this color combination in every format. It's always been very good. I think with the addition of Genie, this deck has become one of the best decks, if not the best deck of the format. So maybe I'm a little biased. Maybe it's because I've done very well with Ruby Amethyst Red Purple, but I think it's up there in the best decks section. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me. Some people think this deck is too fair. They don't think it's that good. They don't think that it's punishing enough in a 2-game format. I disagree. I feel like if you misplay against Ruby Amethyst, against a good Ruby Amethyst player, whether it's game 1, game 2, on the play, on the draw, you're going to get punished. So if you play against a Ruby Amethyst deck, try not to misplay against them because the deck is very rewarding if you know what you're doing. It actually took first place at the last European Continental, so I mean, who am I to not call it the best deck, right? Next up, we got Yellow Purple Hyper Aggro Laker Nation. This deck has been a menace since the release of Lilo and Maleficent biding her time. I want to say this deck has never been the best deck. It's always very good in the beginning of a format, but it never really solidifies itself in the meta. I personally enjoy Hyper Aggro. I don't think I need to really explain why this deck is scary. If you play against Hyper Aggro, if you're playing a Sapphire strategy, oftentimes you're not in the best position. But what's crazy is that this deck doesn't always guarantee you a win against those slower strategies because you still have to make the right plays. I see a lot of kids play this deck, and I understand why. But personally, I do think that it is still a high skill ceiling. You know, I don't think it's as easy as people make it seem to play a Hyper Aggro deck, at least not on a competitive level. But if you are a Hyper Aggro enjoyer, if you're a Hyper Aggro believer, then take it to your tournaments because I've seen plenty of people win with this color combination. Hyper Aggro with Goats and Daisies is going to go somewhere above mids. I'm going to put it in the good section because it is a little bit better in my opinion than some of the other aggro decks. I think this deck does have the ability to just like out cheese wins because you get to play cards like Goat and you get to play cards like White Flower, even the Dale card that gives more lore, Baloo, Donald Duck. A lot of the cards that burst lore are in both yellow and purple, so combining those just means a good deck to me. I think it's up there with Burn and the Jafar Steel, and you know I would put it there for sure in like a tier 1.5 section, mainly because of the draw power too. The purple engine has draw power, so giving that to the aggressive yellow engine is very good. All right, next up we have Amber Steel Song, a very good deck, also a #1 color combination since the first chapter, right? You want to take advantage of your singers like Cinderella, Ursula, Vanessa, Ariel, maybe you're playing Gaston as well in that deck. But this deck is just so crazy if they get to go first, if they open up the perfect curve. Sometimes you don't even get to play the game. Sometimes you don't get to play the game because Cinderella on turn 1 means that if you play any 1-drop character, most 1-drop characters anyway, that Cinderella is going to be able to sing Storm Rage on, which will deal 2 damage. Or, I've even had it so where they'll play double 1-drop and sing Strength of a Raging Fire. Now that Cinderella is dealing 3 damage on turn 2, that is unfair. Pretty much any character you play on turn 1 will get banished because they have a Cinderella on board. And sometimes that's just the whole game against Amber Steel, because by turns 2 and 3, they're playing Smee and Ariel. Then by turn 4, they're able to dump the rest of their hand, sing a whole new world, get all their songs back, and clear your board. It's very frustrating. It's a very strong deck. However, there is one big flaw in this deck. I hate to remind you Amber Steel players, but you have an unwinnable matchup. The red-blue matchup is notoriously disrespectfully difficult for an Amber Steel song deck to win against consistently anyway. Now, don't get me wrong, there's amazing Amber Steel players in the meta, and I think playing cards like Blue make this strategy even more impactful. However, I still feel like you're just so unfavored against the red-blue color combination. It makes your whole new world dead. Your songs are not that good, where it's very hard to play in a tournament landscape, I think, to win consistently, because the red-blue deck tends to dominate a lot of these tournaments in the metagame. There's always a lot of blue-red representation, and I think sometimes it kind of keeps the Amber Steel song decks a little bit lower in the brackets, whereas decks like Purple Steel tend to have a little bit more lore burst or even draw power without giving your opponent draw, like the rabbits, genies, or even something like goats. Amber Steel song cannot afford to use whole new world against most red-blue game states. It does have a good matchup across the board. However, you can lose tempo in the steel mirror matches as well, which can be a little difficult to master. The deck is really hard to play as well, in my opinion, and great players are always going to win tournaments with whatever deck they choose. But I don't think it's necessarily up there with the best decks, because it does have that huge flaw with constantly having to struggle against the red-blue matchup, and it can have a little bit of a consistency issue. In my opinion, you do have to play a lot of uninkables in this deck, and I've seen a lot of players simply ink pass on turn 1, 2, and 3, sometimes playing Amber Steel song because they've opened up way too many uninkables. So that is another flaw in the deck. It's a great deck, but it's going to go in the better than good section. Not tier 0 with the best decks, but it's up there with tier 1. Next up, we have Aggro songs. This is the Amber Steel Diggy Diggy Hole deck that we have here, created by Brennan DeCandio. It's a very strong deck. It's very aggressive. It's the only Amber Steel deck that I've really seen play locations like Seven Doors Mine, outside of a deck that completely prioritizes locations. I think this deck can take advantage of this location very well, because you're playing 4 copies of Doc, 3 copies of Happy to trigger its extra ability. But Doc is going to be one of the only few draw engines you have in this deck, alongside Rapunzel and cards like Storm Rage on. But it's an aggressive deck. You have a lot of 2 lore questers. You have Daisy, Lilo, Smee, Lawrence, Rapunzel, even this shift Kita, which you don't even have a shift target for. All you're really trying to do is play this Kita on turn 5 so that your opponent can't challenge your characters, like we were talking about. Piglet Quest for 3. Pluto is a huge bodyguard that can protect all of your 2 lore questers. And in my opinion, this deck actually does have a pretty good red-blue matchup. So I do feel like this Amber Steel variant has kind of solved that problem that the red-blue deck has. So I would even put it up here in the best decks, because we've been seeing a lot of success with this deck from our boy Brendan DeCandio over there. And I see a lot of people play this at locals. It's a very good deck in my opinion. I would put it in like tier 0. Sometimes it feels just broken. It has the same ability to make your opponent skip their turn 1 and 2 because they have Cinderella Storm, but it also just plays even more 2 lore questers and a faster way to get to that win condition against your toughest matchup, which is like blue-red, right? I think what I like about this deck more too than the song Amber Steel deck is that your uninkables are a lot more low cost. So what that basically means is you're a lot less likely to brick with this deck. I think it somewhat fixes those consistency issues that you have with Amber Steel songs, because you end up having multiple copies of Whole New World, maybe even Grab Your Swords, Zeus, if you're playing those cards in that deck, right? Okay, next up we have Emerald Steel, and I feel like this is kind of a sleeper deck. In fact, last time we did one of these, I put Emerald Steel in the bottom, and I got disrespected because I do believe Zansaya that ended up getting first place that weekend with Emerald Steel, which is actually pretty crazy. But so don't sleep on this deck. I would even consider it like anti-meta almost, because a lot of people don't play Emerald Steel right now. But it's a very solid deck. You can still go turn 1 Diablo, turn 2 Shift, shift Diablo, move him to the cove to protect Diablo from any mishaps, any shenanigans. You know, a lot of green steel players are using Doc in their deck now too, making it a little bit more low to the ground and having a stronger draw engine. So maybe you want to consider playing some copies of Doc in that deck. But green steel still has the ability to discard your entire hand. I've been seeing people use the Prince John Sudden Chill line since Rise of the Floodborn, and you're able to use Lucifer as well to add some extra discard packages in your deck while also adding some characters that can gain lore. It's a really hard deck to pilot though. It's kind of punishing. So if you want to play green steel in the meta, you got to know what you're doing, in my opinion. But how good is it? How popular is it? I don't think you're guaranteed to play a green steel in the meta anymore. You know, it's so crazy. I'm like last format, literally last format, it was almost guaranteed you'd see a green steel in any tournament, right? Nowadays though, doesn't really feel like it that way that much. You know what it is too? A lot of it is that the Genie is everywhere. Genie Wish Fulfilled is in every purple deck, and that is a clean out to Diablo, especially if you don't have a hidden cove there. So unfortunately, I think because of the way the meta is panning out, there's a lot of Amethyst decks, and most Amethyst decks are playing for Genie and for Elsa Fitzspirit. I don't think we can put Emerald Steel in the best decks section. It's not tier 0. I don't know if we can put it in the better than good section because I don't think it's tier 1. So I think it's going to have to go in the good section, a tier 1.5 deck. Still very good. If you're going to play a set championship with Emerald Steel, I think you can win it. You know, more power to you. In fact, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if Emerald Steel proves me wrong and gets first place again at the North American Continentals, because it is Ruby Amethyst's toughest matchup, in my opinion. Discard decks can be Ruby Amethyst's toughest matchup. And in general, I do think though that it does have a tougher matchup against something like Amber Steel Songs, Aggro Amber Steel, Purple Steel, even Red Blue can be kind of a tough matchup sometimes. Next up, we're going to go over the yellow-green discard deck. I definitely have a tough time playing against this deck as a Ruby Amethyst player because they oftentimes go turn 3 Prince John, turn 4 You Have Forgotten Me, which will discard 2 cards from my hand and let them draw 2. It's a very strong deck. It's the only deck that has a combo that has a one-sided board wipe because you're able to shift Kita, then sing Under the Sea with your ward characters to completely move all of the opponent's characters to the bottom of the deck most of the time. You also have copies of You're Welcome to shuffle in maybe a pesky location or some big boss characters into the opponent's deck. They're going to draw 2 cards, but it doesn't matter because oftentimes you can just play Sudden Chills, Bare Necessities, even the Shift Basil, which will let you discard a card from the opponent if you ink any cards. Shout out Diego Sauce. He won a whole DLC with green-yellow discard, so I think it's a very good deck. I don't think you should sleep on it. However, I think the meta has adapted to be able to combat a deck like this. Before, it used to be heavily reliant on getting value off of Diablo, but there's so many Diablo killers in the meta now. So given the amount of Diablo killers in the meta, all the evasive characters that can stop this deck, I do think it is going to have to go in the good section. Not necessarily better than good. You know, I wouldn't put it in the best deck. It's not mids. You know, it's better than tier 2. There's a lot of good decks you can play is where I'm getting at right now so far. Next up, we have green-red discard. Now, I'll be real with you guys. I didn't even know that was a deck. I don't think that's a real deck. I don't know if that's a real deck. Like I said, Speci made this one, and I'm going off of that. Thank you, Speci, for making this. But and I did see the video, by the way. But I just have to ask, like, when have you ever played against this deck, bro? I've never seen anybody play this at locals. So I don't think it's something you should really look out for in the sense of like prepare for it. Like I wouldn't tell my friend like, hey, test against me. I need to learn how to beat the green-red discard deck. You know, I don't think it's that serious. I found this list right now online by Lorgains. Huge shout out to Lorgains, a fellow top 16er who's going to be competing in the North American Continentals as well. This is his rendition of a deck. You know, Robin. We got 2 copies of Robin Hood, 2 copies of Prince John. So I think this is a deck that you kind of play like that, right? Maybe you're just generating value with your discard engine. Like we don't talk about Bruno and Sudden Chill. You know, trying to get some extra value with Maui Half Sharks. But I don't know. I don't feel like the strategy is all there for this color combination. And maybe I'm hating on the idea. Maybe I just haven't tested it myself. But quite frankly, this is Buns. We have our first Buns deck of the night. It's gonna have to go to green-red discard, green-red action. I just don't think the color combination of Emerald and Ruby is quite there yet. You can maybe play the Ruby Emerald evasive deck. I think that might be a little bit more of a consistent win con. However, there's just so many outs to not only evasive characters but aggro characters with people playing cards like Fire the Cannon, Storm Rage on. It is a little bit of a harder strategy to try and win with. So I'm not saying you can't win a Lorcana set championships with green-red. I'm just saying you're probably not going to see a lot of people winning a set championships with green red, and I would not bet any money that this deck can win the North American Continentals. Next up, we got Blurple. Blue Purple has been making a lot of waves in the last couple weeks. I've been seeing a lot of people play this at my locals in some local big tournaments, a lot of tournaments online. I've been seeing Blurple in these top 8s. It's for sure a deck that I would for sure want to get some play testing against, just to make sure I'm fully confident before I go into any tournaments, because I wouldn't be surprised if I pair into a Blurple player in one of my rounds, at least one. It's a really good deck. One of my friends explained it as it's the purple deck that lets you play your purple cards first in the opponent. So whether or not if you're going first or second, if you're in a purple mirror match, you're going to be able to play your Genies, your Elsas, and all your other power cards way faster than the opponent. Some people think this deck has a very good matchup against a lot of the Ruby style decks that can play Be Prepared, because you're using Diablos and Rabbits and stuff like that to constantly generate advantage even through the board wipes. However, I think the deck is buns. Just kidding. This deck is not buns. This deck is actually pretty good. Pretty good. I want to even say it's better than good. But it's not quite there yet, personally. I think it does have a little bit of an issue with having a lot of power cards. I like Hades. Hades is a great card. However, because you have a lot of uninkables as well in the color combination, you can't play like more than 2, maybe 3 Hades, or you have to play some type of ratio between Hades and Elsa. And if those are the strongest cards in your deck, if those are your bombs, I feel like you're not really ramping into the strongest cards in the game the way a deck like Ruby Sapphire does. Ruby Sapphire just ramps into power cards just as fast as you do. However, their power cards are a lot stronger. Elsa does not banish anything. Hades gives your opponent extra ink. And one of the biggest issues is that you do not have a reset button. You don't have ways to clear a big board. There's no grab your swords. There's no be prepared. You don't have any AoE. So whenever I play against Blurple, I tend to tell myself, this deck cannot be prepared the board. They can't wipe an entire board. So if I just play as many characters as possible faster than them, I can keep up. And that's usually my strategy, and it does work. Blurple's a great deck, don't get me wrong. And once again, would not be surprised if somebody wins Continentals with a deck like this. But I do feel like it has its flaws. Its matchups might not be the best across the board. If it goes into the late game a little too much when you're playing against Sapphire decks, when you're playing against Ruby decks, they're going to be able to board wipe you, and you can't board wipe them back. And if you lose tempo against some of these Amber Steel decks, some of these Purple Steel decks, they're going to flood the board with characters, and you can't come back either. It's not tier 2, but it's definitely tier 1.5. Next up, we got Green Purple. Now, a lot of people say this is an aggro deck. Some people say it's mid-range, depending on how you're playing it. Personally, to me, it has the ability to do both, because you're playing tons of 2 lore questers like Merfolk, Bonsai, Genie, but you also get to control the mid-game. But you also get to control the early games with your Foxes, your Crabs. Even Ursula the Deceiver is going to snipe songs out of the opposing hand if you're playing against Amber Steel Song. Cloud Kicker is great for tempo. Peter Pan lets you deal with evasive characters. You have the extra lore burst from Merlin Goat, White Rose, a bunch of draw power because you're playing Genies and Rabbits. You even have 2 7-cost characters in this deck because they can shift for 5. And in my opinion, it's some of the best cards in the game. You got Clarabelle, which will let you draw a bunch of cards. You got Ursula, which can quest for 3, stops people from singing songs as well, and exerts opposing characters. Now, the reason it sounds like I'm hyping this deck up so much is because I am hyping it up a lot, because I personally think it's up there in the best decks section. Yes, I think this is up there in this like tier 0 section, tier 0.5 with the top decks of the format. It feels like a rock paper scissors format sometimes, but I do think green, purple, mid-range, aggro, whatever you want to call it, I think the color combination is very strong right now. One of the key things about it too is that you're able to play Go-Go Tamago. That card's going to let you punish the opponent really heavily, and in some of these big tournaments, if you're not playing around cards like that, you're going to lose, and it's going to be really impactful. So be sure to play test against green, purple. Be sure to know how to not lose to Go-Go Tamago and all the other cards in that deck, because to me, it's one of the best decks. Next up, let's talk about red, yellow Mufasa, or as Bessie calls it, Bufasa, Lily Fasa, as it's known here in the States, by the way. But yeah, red, yellow Mufasa. This is a list by Wonderful. Shout out you for always cooking up some cool red, yellow lists. I think a lot of Mufasa decks are in a good position right now because a lot of people are playing Ruby Amethyst. You do have the ability to start off with some early questers like Moana, maybe even a Piglet. You can play Milan or Mother Gothel so you can heal them with Rapunzel later. You got copies of Super Goo. We have 2 copies of Prince Eric. Doc as well is a very good card in this deck because you can use Doc to play your Mufasa a turn early. You also have Gaston. Gaston is a very strong card in this deck. This is a 3-cost uninkable. You pay 2 less for the next character you play this turn if you exert this Gaston. So on turn 3 you play Gaston. Turn 4 you can ink. Exert Gaston. Now your Lady Tremaine, your Madame Medusa, maybe even your Mulan cost 2 less. You can play them on turn 4. Pretty good in my opinion. I love to see it. And in the later game, you have cards like Chernabog, Big Sisu, Wreck-It Ralph, even Stitch to quest for a bunch and gain some extra lore. It's a really good deck. Red Yellow Mufasa is a very good deck. I'm a believer. Is it gonna win the Continentals? Probably not. Can it win a set championships? I think so. I think it can win a set championships. However, is it likely to win a set championships? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't want to put it in good, but I do think it's good. I do think it's good, but I don't think it's mids necessarily. But because so just ignore this name. This is mids tier 2. Mids tier 2. There, tier 2. Yeah, because we need to let you guys know. It's gonna go into tier 2 section. I think it's a tier 2 deck. I don't think it's the best deck. I think it does have some consistency issues, and I think if you want to play the color combination of red and yellow, this is probably the way you want to play it. However, the red cards are a lot better in some other color combos, as well are the yellow cards. But not to say that you can't win. Wonderful. You know, you're probably watching, and I'm a big fan of your deck, by the way. I want to try it out myself, but I'm just saying. It's probably tier 2. You probably won't see anybody play this at most of your tournaments, you know, so I wouldn't like take too much time into practicing against this deck. However, you should know what it does, because there are going to be players like Wonderful who do take it to those events, and they can do well with it. I just think that it is a tier 2 deck. It's not as popular as some of these other ones, and on top of it not being as popular, I think the power level is a little bit lower. It does have a little bit smaller of a power level than some of these other decks. And it's not to say it's a bad deck by any means. No. Don't get me wrong. I like the strategy. I like the idea of playing Mufasa this format. I think Mufasa is really good. In fact, so good that our boy Diego Saz, he got top 4 at a tournament playing his version of Yellow Purple Mufasa, Laker Nation Mufasa. And I think it's a very good deck. There's a couple ways to play Mufasa this format. You can play it with Amber Amethyst. You can play it with Amber Steel as well. I think Amber Steel Mufasa is a very strong deck. And you can also play it with Amber Emerald. Amber Emerald Mufasa. In fact, I think the 3 color combos I just mentioned might be a little bit more consistent, in my opinion, of a win strategy than the original red-yellow Mufasa deck. It's crazy because red-yellow Mufasa was like the way people used to play it, and I feel like now maybe you might want to consider something along the lines of like yellow-purple Mufasa. I think this version of the deck fits very well in the meta. So I did make a whole tab dedicated to just the Mufasa decks. The red-yellow Mufasa, like I said, is still going to stay in the tier 2 section because it's not my favorite version. However, if you are playing yellow-purple Mufasa or even yellow-steel, Amber Steel Mufasa, I would put it up here. I want to even put it in I want to put it in the better than good section. It's going to be in the tier I would put it in the tier 1 section because it does have that huge surprise factor. If somebody starts playing Amber Amethyst and it's a Mufasa deck, oh, I'm going to be confused. In fact, that did happen to me in Atlanta. Josh Polt, he got first place with yellow purple Mufasa and he beat me in top 16 while he was playing this deck, and it was really hard. It was very difficult. Like I said, sleeper deck, better than good. Mufasa strategies are going to be up there. I would say Amber Steel and yellow purple Mufasa are going to be up there in the tier 1 section. You know what? I changed my mind. You probably won't see too many of them at the tournaments, though. Maybe you'll see one of those kind of decks, so it is going to go in the good section. After thinking about it, there's no way this deck is better than Emerald Steel discard, but I think it's there. I think it's on that power level, so we're going to move it to tier 1.5. Not tier 1, tier 1.5, and that's for Amber Steel Mufasa and Purple Yellow Mufasa. Maybe even Green Yellow Mufasa. All right, as you can see here, there's 3 different location decks we got to cover real quick. Amber Steel Locations is the first deck I want to go over from this location batch. This is actually a list that was used in a top 32 of DLC Seattle, actually. And I haven't updated it or nothing for the current meta, but this is a very real deck. I do think that this deck can be used in the current meta. Maybe you want to add a little bit to it to kind of adjust to the new stuff. But I kind of want to put this in the tier 2 section. I don't know how good this location deck would be right now. However, I do like that it plays cards like the John Silver, the Treasure Seeker. It also plays 4 Fire the Cannons, which is really good too. I think any deck that can play Fire the Cannons and constantly keep control of the board while generating passive lore is pretty nice. So I don't want to knock it out of contention. I think it's a very reasonable deck. Let's go over this red-yellow location deck now. I'm not even going to bring up a red-yellow location list because I don't think it's necessarily worth looking at. The deck is not anywhere in the meta. I don't think anybody really I've seen some people play it. You can use the new Amber Sugar Rush with Jim Hawkins, but I don't think it does too much in the current meta. So unfortunately, my Amber Ruby location players, you're gonna end up in the buns section. So I just don't think this is a good strategy right now in the meta. There's way too many foxes and crabs. There's Elsas running around that have rush. People are playing Maui. There's Maui half sharks. Maui half shark is huge. It clears almost any location. So I don't know if you can necessarily afford to put a location on the board that's not going to generate you any lore in a strategy, and that location has a huge move cost as well. All right, Ruby Steel Pirates is the next deck. It's a location deck in my opinion. It's not too bad of a deck. You can start off with some early aggression with Happy and Moana to start questing. Then turn 2, you can go full into Sisu, maybe even some other cool characters because you have some extra locations to set up. You have Dwarves Mine, RLS, Legacy for your Jim Hawkins. So definitely not a popular deck. I don't see people playing this deck anymore. I have seen the strategy of Flynn Rider into Gustav or Flynn Rider into Sisu and some of the Ruby Steel decks to kind of have a little bit more of an aggressive start because you're able to control the mid game with Super Goofs, Mauis, Fire the Cannons. Lawrence will quest for 2. The John Silver Greedy Treasure Seeker will gain extra lore and resist for all the locations you have, and you play some pretty good locations like Dwarves Mine, Legacy. We're also playing Bad and Non because it's 7 willpower location that will generate you 1 lore every turn. So 7 willpower on a 3-cost location, still pretty hefty, I think. Now, are you going to see red steel locations at your local tournament scene? Probably not. I don't think it's buns necessarily. I think it's better than buns, so I'm going to put it in the tier 2 section. Not necessarily up there in better than good. Personally, I do think Ruby Steel is a good deck. And in fact, we have seen it do very well at some of the DLC tournaments. So don't knock it out of contention at your local tournament scene. However, for Continentals, I don't know if this is the best deck in the 2-game format. It could be, though. It very well could be. Maybe I'm sleeping on it. Any Ruby Steel enjoyers, let me know below. Up next, we have the Blue Cow deck. Yes, Clarabelle Sapphire strategy. In my opinion, if you're going to play a deck like this, you better be a pro because this is a hard deck to pilot and overall doesn't seem like the most consistent deck in the meta. Personally, when I play blue-green, I don't play it with items like this. I don't play popsicles and flavor shams. I don't think that's how you're supposed to play blue-green. I think if you're playing blue-greens with this many items, you're playing it wrong. Just my personal opinion. I'm sorry, but I've been trying to get people to play blue-green in a more tempo style for like the last 4 or 5 months, and it's a good deck. However, it's just not there in my opinion. I do think it lacks a lot of tools to be really competitive in the meta. So if you're playing a blue-green cow Clarabelle with your items in the deck, I do think you're gonna have a tough time in this format. If you're playing a lot of the items in the item variant, with popsicles and flavor shams, even if you're playing more of a tempo variant, like my boy Jace, shout out Jace for playing the tempo blue-green, I think it's a good deck. I think the idea of ramping into Clarabelle, drawing a bunch of cards, and then using Bend to My Will to discard all those cards is very strong. However, it does have an issue with not being able to clear the board. And if you do want to clear the board, you have to play a lot of cards like Ice Block, Under the Sea, maybe Muses, stuff like that. So it does have some consistency. So because it doesn't have much of a huge power level and it does have some consistency issues, it lacks draw power outside of Clarabelle, and it plays a lot of Uninkables. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to put the Blue Cow deck in the buns section. I'm sorry, my blue-green believers. I am a blue-green fiend. I like playing blue-green. Even if we weren't playing the Flavor Sham version, I still think that the blue-green right now is just it's in the buns section. I want it to be good. Trust me. I would love to ramp into Bend to My Will. And I think, like I said, I think the tempo version still has a lot of potential. I just don't think right now, with everything running around in the meta, at least I wouldn't have a good time playing blue-green at a local tournament because I feel like it's going to be a constant uphill battle. Next up, everybody's favorite, Ruby Sapphire. I feel like I've been talking about this deck all video because it's just so popular. Everybody's playing this deck. You're either playing 4 Maui Half Shark or Lucky Dime or something along the lines of that so you can burst a bunch of lore without your opponent seeing it coming. 2 Pirate's Life is just so clutch in this meta. There's been so many times where I'm playing, goats and white flowers, and I think all I gotta do is play Goat Bounce and I win next turn. And then all of a sudden my opponent goes Maui Shark, play Pirate's Life, sing my other Pirate's Life. Suddenly, I've lost 4 lore and they've gained 6 lore, right? And then next turn, they win. So if you thought blue-red was tough before, be prepared to see this deck at every tournament you go to. This deck ramps so much more consistently now because you have Sail the Azurite Sea and Tipo. Sometimes it doesn't even feel bad to just hardcast Halfaro go on turn 4. The addition of Maui Half Shark in this deck stops your opponent from questing whenever they want. I feel like the big problem with red-blue was that you had to set up a lot of turns and your opponent was able to just play a bunch of characters and quest with them willy-nilly while you got your setup going of Popsicle Flavor Sham. Now, however, the moment you drop Maui Half Shark onto the board, you stop your opponent from quest and you slow the game down a lot. I feel like Maui Half Shark is the solution to the problems that this deck had. Pirate's Life helps a lot too because, like I said, it slows the game down in your favor. It puts your opponent further away from the finish line, and this deck can definitely stop your opponent from questing any lore if they're at 19. I've lost many games where I'm at 19 lore. I just need to draw a goat. I just need to top deck a white flower, and it doesn't matter because my opponent just keeps stopping every character that I play, and I can't see it, and they get to 20 faster than me. So due to its popularity and its power level, we know that Ruby Sapphire Control is going to go in the best decks section, in the tier 0 section, as one of the best decks. I just got to be honest, like, you're more than likely guaranteed to play against at least one Ruby Sapphire Control deck in your tournament. Whenever I build decks in this meta, I'm always asking myself, how do I out Maui Shark? What's my out to Flavor Sham? How do I stop Tamatoas? What do I do if they drop a lucky dime on me? So yeah, definitely up there with one of the best decks of the format for sure. And last but not least, we got to go over Blue Steel. Whether or not you're playing the Whole New World variant or your Heartland Suite and you're playing the non-Whole New World version, I think Blue Steel is still going to have a prominent place in the meta. I don't know how guaranteed you are to play against a Blue Steel in a tournament. I'm not really over preparing for this matchup because not that many friends I know play it. It's very rare that I see anybody play this at a local tournament, but in my past DLCs, I've always played against at least one Blue Steel player. So I for sure know that this deck exists. This deck, like Ruby Sapphire, can ramp into some bombs very quickly. The scariest part about this deck, though, is that they play cards like Fire the Cannons, which will let you control the early game a lot faster than something like Ruby Sapphire. This deck is for sure playing 2 copies of Lucky Dime because it's taking advantage of the 3 copies of Tamatoa and 2 Aerial Treasure Collector. You can even take advantage of cards like Gantu in this deck where you have Lucky Dime up already because you could just gain the 4 lore off of Dime when you play Gantu. Also a very good deck that can play McDuck Manor, and like locations are pretty good in the meta right now. However, Maui Shark plus Vitalisphere can eliminate McDuck Manor, which is not my favorite. The fact that you can ramp into McDuck Manor and then control the board with cards like Zeus, Fire the Cannon, still really good. If you're playing Whole New World, you're able to play Cogsworth and use Cogsworth as a singer for your Whole New World. Maybe you're playing cards like Grab Your Swords because, you know, Sapphire Steel feels like the only deck that can play Grab Your Swords because you're able to actually ramp into that card and play it earlier than other decks. But yeah, I do not doubt the power level of Sapphire Steel. In fact, I do believe we did see it make day 2 and it's somewhere in top 16, maybe even top 8 of the European Continentals. So it's definitely not Buns. It's not tier 2. I want to say it's good. I want to even say it's better than good. Yeah, it's better than good. I would put Sapphire Steel up there in tier 1.5, just a little bit higher than decks like Blurple, the Mufasa decks, and even Emerald Steel Discard. A lot of Sapphire Steel decks are playing the Cogsworth, like I mentioned, and Cogsworth is a very strong out to Steel mirror matches, which is really good. And personally, when I play against Sapphire Steel, there's just been games where they Fishbone Quill their whole hand away, they use Whole New World, they get a whole new hand, they play it out again, use another Whole New World, and they do that 3, 4, 5 times in a match. And you just can't do anything. Some people say it feels like a high roll deck. I think it's just better than good. But bam, there it is, folks, my Lorcana Goons. This is our tier list for the meta. I can't wait to play Continentals on Saturday. I am so nervous, but this is how I think the meta is going to go down. You know, I think I'm for sure going to play one of the best decks throughout my 7 rounds, at least once, whether it be red, purple, the aggro diggy hole deck, the green, purple aggro mid-range deck, or the red, blue control deck. I feel like I'm guaranteed to see at least one of these one time in that tournament. In the decks that are better than good that I'm more than likely going to see, Amber Steel Songs with Whole New World, maybe Sapphire Steel again, because I always see it at these tournaments. I'm definitely preparing to face a bunch of purple steel decks, and I'm learning, so I'm for sure taking notes and learning how to combat them. There are plenty of other good decks in the meta like Jafar, the Ruby Amethyst Burn, Hyper Aggro, Emerald Steel Discard, Green Yellow Discard, Blurple, and all the Mufasa variants. So if you're playing your set championships, be aware that these decks exist, and if you're playing any of these decks, I know you can win your set championships with them as well. Just because these decks are mid right here does not mean you should disregard them. Be sure to look out for the blue-yellow aggro deck, the red-yellow Mufasa decks, and some of these strong location decks in your meta, and some of these strong location decks in your local meta. However, I wouldn't personally over-prepare for any green-red, any red-yellow location, or any blue cow decks, because I do think those decks are buns and I'm not necessarily going to be playtesting against those decks. But that's been all for this tier list video, my Lorcana Goons. Thank you so much for sticking around if you've seen this whole thing. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you're a Lorcana Goon because it does support the channel. My name is Kevin. I get to play in the North American Continentals this Saturday. Wish me luck, my Lorcana Goons, but until then, we'll see you Goons next time.